Thank you, everybody. It's good to see you. It's great to be at Watkins. I've heard so much about this bookstore. It has a venerable reputation. I'm honored to be asked to read here. I'm going to be talking tonight about survival through adversity and how moving through the dark brings out strengths in us, insights in us that we wouldn't have in any other way. I'm going to read from the introduction of the book. I'll read for about 20 minutes or so, and then I'd love to have a question and answer conversation to get deeper into the issues of survivorship and how mortality and the awareness of impermanence feeds the spiritual path, how it actually becomes our teacher when we find ourselves at the edge of life and death. Okay, so I'm going to begin with the introduction. I'll read for about 20 minutes, and then we can talk. I'll give you a bit of preface. Is when I was 21 years old, my older sister came to visit me. She'd been having a very hard time. She'd been going through a serious depression. She'd been hospitalized, and she came to my house. She just showed up one day looking terrible. And I said, "What is it, Marcia? What is it? Let me help you." And first she wouldn't say anything, and I kept asking. Finally she said, "How do you do it?" And I said, "Do what?" She said, "How do you live?" And it was a question I had never asked myself before. I was 21, I was trying to make it in the world, I was an alpha male in New York City, I was trying to be a success, and I hadn't actually asked myself that question, how do you live? So I gave her a lot of platitudes about you put one foot in front of the other, you just have to, what choice do you have? And I tried to encourage her. And she left my house that day, and it was the last time that I saw her alive. She committed suicide 2 weeks later. And so for me it became a mantra. How do you live? What would I have said to my sister had I had the wisdom or the wherewithal or the maturity to help her in a moment of serious crisis? And that's what led to my writing When You're Falling Dive and interviewing all of these incredible survivors from various walks of life in various kinds of adversity. So I'm going to read from the introduction now. How do you live, Marcia had asked. The question would haunt me in years to come, following some great loss or disappointment, some piece of unexpected bad luck when I was exposed enough to wonder. How does a person survive his own life? The ceaseless surprises, uncertainties, struggles, reroutings in strange, inconvenient directions. What force is it exactly that flips a falling man back on his feet, reconstitutes him after disaster, helps him prevail in the face of challenges far beyond his previous limits? What mysterious strength is it that enables us to outsmart the terrorists within, as one psychologist described them to me? Those destructive maniacs under the skin, cynicism, despair, resignation, terror, that threaten to stop us in our tracks. Finally, how is it possible not merely to survive our greatest obstacles, but to prevail in circumstances that threaten to stop us? This quandary intensified substantially for me when mortality paid an unwelcome visit. One afternoon in 1984, lying on a Jamaica beach with my best friend John from college, I found a purple lesion on the ball of his foot that had not been there the day before. Lives, like buildings, have foundation walls. Remove these crucial supports and the whole thing comes crashing down around your ears. In the instant that I saw John's lesion, in the seconds it took me to realize what it probably meant for both of us. Though our friendship had been platonic, life as I'd known it cracked down the middle from chimney to basement. The house I'd lived in, the self I'd believed in, the future I thought was waiting for me, was suddenly condemned. John was dead within 3 months. For the next 10 years, I lived in a state of near constant anxiety, waiting for my own demise, scared each morning when I looked in the mirror and what forbidding signs I might find there. Mostly I couldn't breathe. In her famous essay on affliction, Simone Weil likened this acute state of dread to that of a condemned man forced to stare for hours at the guillotine that's going to cut off his head. You shake, you wait, you do your best not to pee in your pants while people are watching. But no one can stay panicked forever. You're forced to find a way through your terror before any viable answers appear, while the floor is dropping beneath you. It's a sloppy, lurching, imperfect business. Though not quite yourself, post-catastrophe, neither are you equipped to cope with the fallout from such seismic changes. You haven't grown those muscles yet or begun to reimagine your story. You're more like the American lobster, which dives for a few days each year to the ocean floor to slough off its old shell and wait for a new one, a naked, pink-skinned glob of flesh trying not to get smashed too hard before its second skin grows back. In my case, this retreat took the form of spiritual seeking. I became a compulsive nomadic seeker, living hand to mouth for most of the 10 years, trawling for wisdom from spiritual teachers around the world, gulping it down in desperation. These years were traumatic yet eye-opening. I kept a saying in my wallet: in a world of fugitives, the man who goes in the opposite direction will always be said to be running away. I needed to find out for myself if anything existed of a man beyond this booby-trapped bag of bones. As a skeptical agnostic, I dove warily into the question of whether anything metaphysical truly existed, or if human beings really were just blips on the screen of a heartless creation, dying animals like a billion others, born to eat and talk and die, as I had been raised to believe. This philosophical question had struck me for the first time at age 7, when I lifted the lid off a garbage can and found my first dead thing, a blue jay's corpse, swaddled in plastic and newsprint. I stood there a long time staring down at the cat-chewed body, wondering whether the bird had been this pile of bloody feathers or the thing that had escaped. Which, more pertinently now, was I. The primary insight that arose from those years had nothing at all to do with religion. In fact, the single most transformative idea to emerge from all that reading, meditation, and ashram schlepping was simply this: that terror can be a door to enlightenment. While traditional cultures have long understood the empowering aspects of fear and wounding, the double-edged force of passage rites to galvanize and deepen the spirit, we are too often shielded from this secret knowledge. Our prevailing contemporary view of pain and loss as handicaps to be avoided at any cost is not only wrong-headed, but deeply ass-backward. Terror is fuel. Wounding is power. Darkness carries the seeds of redemption. Authentic strength isn't found in our armor, but at the very pit of the wounds each of us manages to survive. As one widow put it to me, strength doesn't mean being able to stand up to anything, but being able to crawl on your belly a long, long time before you can stand up again. Transformation is in our wiring. Looking backward is a Humpty-Dumpty waste of time. You're going to come out gold on the other side, one heroic man said to me in this book, or you're not going to come out at all. While hardship can certainly render us bitter, selfish, defensive, and miserable, it can also be used quite differently as the artery of interconnection, a bridge to other people in pain, as blood in the muscle that propels us. Crisis takes us to the brink of our limits and forces us to keep moving forward. When people in extremis call it a blessing, this is the paradox that they're describing. It's why men sometimes blossom in wartime and women are often changed by childbirth. They come alive as never before on that knife blade of danger and pain. There's vitality in facing life's extremes, including that of your own extinction. Crisis pushes you to travel wide, fast, and deep, expands the heart, and calls forth reserves of courage you didn't know you had, like adrenaline in the muscles of a mother saving her only child. Only you are the child, and it's your life, the life of your own soul, that you are saving. This paradox is hard to swallow. When I used to tell friends half-jokingly that HIV had actually saved my life, they rarely understood what I meant. I wasn't promoting an awful virus or claiming I was glad to have it. I wasn't pretending to be overjoyed by the prospect of an early departure. I was simply confessing an odd bit of truth that I wouldn't have believed myself had my own life not improved so dramatically. Without the threat of mortal loss, I would never have had the conviction, the fuel, to become the person I wanted to be, or to find my way through terrible dread to something stronger than my fear. Survival, I came to understand, has less to do with cheating death than with living as brilliantly as possible. There are new ways of seeing, of being, in a world turned upside down. There's an art to turning poison into a boon. Even during the worst of times, as I plummeted into some squall of fear, it never failed that some involuntary, irrational wave would sweep me up sooner or later, as if out of nowhere. Other times there was satisfaction in the battle itself, a tenacious hunger to stay alive, when I was glad to simply be here, to fight, to participate, even when the going was tough. Every situation has the potential for this greening, this viriditas, as Hildegard of Bingen called it, this bringing of beauty, insight, or healing from the manure of suffering. We're reconstituted after being crushed, fleshed out again after being stripped, by the mysterious, profligate, glowing, extravagant force that courses through and electrifies the phenomenal world. Though we're immersed in this power at every moment, survivors realize how profoundly quality of life is determined by how skillfully we harness ourselves to that evergreen force at the heart of things. Just as we recognize beauty when we see it, we respond to those who have tapped into this secret. They seem larger and more alive somehow, as if working from a more vivified palette. It's no accident that such impassioned, inventive people have frequently endured greater than usual doses of pain. Where adversity crosses paths with aliveness, there is the potential for art, as well as for artful living. Although we may not all be masters, we can learn from such enlightened souls and witness their greening survivor's genius for self-renewal. Seeking out masters of this art, following their various footsteps through their particular labyrinths, I saw that there might be a way to compose a chorus, the Aboriginals call it a song line, to serve as a map for people crossing their own wilderness, a voice map to this dark geography. As the poet Theodore Retke reminded us, in a dark time the eye begins to see. With our illusions of safety exploded, outside the bounds of normal life, quote unquote, new abilities do indeed dawn in a person. Values, intuitions, skills, perspectives that might seem unnatural, even perverse, to those who've led more sheltered lives. But what do people like me have to teach? Something about the limitations of rational thought, our supreme powers of adaptation, the short shelf life of shock, the fraternity of the Anawim, people who have experienced great loss, the enlargement of self through tragedy, the absence of guilt, the paradoxical thrill of endangerment, the actual flimsiness of the narratives each of us composes for his life, believing the dots to be connected when in fact they're just dots, the paltriness of survival without spirit, the role of verve and imagination, what the French call je m'en foutisme, the brave art of not giving a damn, once your back is already against the wall and you choose to move forward anyway. Awe is so much vaster than pleasure. It is boundless, transcending cliched ideas about good and evil, pleasure and pain, success and failure, redemption and loss. Fortune spins her mad wheel, reverses, slows down a moment, then spins up again and speeds up again in her maddening round. Survival requires a dose of madness, what cynics call hoping against hope, just like art does. You conjure your future from white space, locate the hidden person, yourself, against this unfamiliar background, peering through grief and loss at something greater. Survivors are more urgently rooted in life than most of us, observed one Holocaust expert. Their will to survive is one with the thrust of life itself, as stubborn as the upsurge of spring. A strange exultation fills their soul, a sense of being equal to the worst. I knew this strange exultation myself, of being destroyed yet beyond destruction. Mystical as this may sound, even the hardest-headed atheists I spoke with would echo some version of the same awareness, a retrieved sense of sacredness, even transcendence, flooding the vacuum of survival where common protections had been stripped away. Terror does have its purposes. Rachel Remen, who's a fantastic doctor and writer who you may know, said to me, "If I cut you, your entire healing system, physical, emotional, spiritual, will be mobilized instantly and become more alive in you, more activated than before. For this reason, survivors may be our greatest teachers in an increasingly terrorized world." That's because we spend so much of our lives in a waking trance of retrospection, regret, distraction, idling, and disembodiment through a range of addictions, so that when the bottom does fall out, life assumes a sudden counterintuitive richness and clarity where there was haze. We're starched into the present tense, where we stop and gaze around with wonder at existence on a mysterious planet. Epiphanies happen where life and death meet. The very walls we construct to protect our lives hide the full glory of those lives from us. It's strange but true that we live immured by our own best intentions, and that the human mind is so constructed, and our powers of denial so baroque, that nothing short of catastrophe has the power to snap us out of our trance. Marcel Proust described this anomaly best, as usual. "I think that life would suddenly seem wonderful to us," wrote the hypersensitive Frenchman, "if we were threatened to die, as you say. Just think of how many projects, travels, love affairs, studies our life hides from us, made invisible by our laziness, which, certain of a future, delays them incessantly. But let all this threaten to become impossible forever, how beautiful it would become again. Ah, if only the cataclysm doesn't happen this time, we won't miss visiting the new galleries of the Louvre, throwing ourselves at the feet of Miss X, making a trip to India. But the cataclysm doesn't happen. We don't do any of it, because we find ourselves back in the heart of normal life, where negligence deadens desire. And yet we shouldn't have needed the cataclysm to love life today. It would have been enough to think that we are humans and that death may come this evening." I love that. Confronting our own impermanence is the skeleton key to a secret life. After surviving his own vision quest before re-entering civilian life, Carlos Castaneda was advised by his Yaqui teacher, Don Juan, to keep death on his shoulder. Mortality becomes a muse. The notion that fear disappears is absurd. But how is it possible to stand up to the terrorists within us? How do we live once the ground starts shaking? That's what my sister Marcia wanted to know. And today I would tell her that there is an art. There are songlines, principles, signposts, tricks, shortcuts, and ways of making it better. Plato described such life-saving wisdom as techne tou biou, meaning the craft of life. And that's what this book is about. There's a craft to living. There are ways of moving through the darkest moments of our lives with grace, with balance, with dignity, and with insight. Because there are experiences and kinds of wisdom that we can only access when we're in deep grief or loss or despair. That's the paradox. That's the upside of suffering, is it is grist for awakening. Okay? It offers possibilities of self-knowledge that we don't have in any other way. When we're in the midst of our everyday lives, when we're comfortable, who wants to look at this stuff? No one wants to look at this stuff. It's not till your back is up against the wall that you're forced to reach down deep in yourself and find a reservoir of strength that you don't even know is there when life is treating you well and moving you along and things are hunky-dory. Okay? That's the value of moving through the dark. That's what I learned from talking to these amazing survivors in When You're Falling Down. That if we're willing to change, as long as we're willing to imagine our lives in different ways, once we've gone through some great loss or crisis, then transformation is possible. If you're trying to make things the way they were, if you're trying to swim backward, upstream, you're lost. You won't learn anything. You won't be willing to discover new ways of being, and you'll live in the sense of diminished, instead of looking at what is there that was never there before. And this isn't Pollyanna. These aren't platitudes. This is something I've lived and many, many other survivors have lived. It's an extraordinary thing. So that it makes you, I don't wish for bad things to happen. I don't wish for loss. I certainly don't want to die tomorrow. But I certainly don't want to go back to that trance of being asleep and imagining that I had forever and deadening desire in my life. That's what I was doing before this happened to me, and that's why I used to say that getting a diagnosis actually saved my life. because it gave me my work. It led me to spiritual seeking, which I had not done before, and I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have had the fuel or had that sense of urgency if I thought I had forever. Okay? So this has been my path. It's been the path of many other survivors. There are extraordinary people in this book, from Auschwitz survivors to a woman who lost her 3-year-old daughter to cancer, to people who have been homeless or refugees from their country. There are all kinds of colors of loss, varieties of crisis and adversity. But they all have that one thing in common, the willingness to change. If you don't have the willingness to change, if you don't have the willingness to be humbled by life, you can't be enlarged by the experience. If you're trying to hold on to your pride, you're lost. And that's the good news. When you have everything stripped away, you have, as Basho said, a better view of the moon. You know, with the walls of my house burned down, I have a better view of the moon. And that really is what happens when life throws you a curve and you stand up to it and ask yourself, what can I learn from this? How can this connect me to other people? How can this deepen my gratitude for my life? That's the other thing when you've been through a hard time is the gratitude you feel simply for being here. That's very, very hard to explain to people who have not been at the edge. The other day I was talking to a friend of mine, he's turning 60, and he's so depressed because he's getting love handles and he's losing his hair, and all he can do is talk about everything that he's losing. And I asked him, what about the gratitude? You know, what about just being thankful for this day? This is an extraordinary moment that will never come again. And he looked at me like I was talking Greek. He couldn't really hear me because he's led a charmed life. This is somebody who told a couple of years ago, he says he had always felt invulnerable. So if you've lived your life feeling invulnerable, sure, you're going to be let down when you start losing your hair. I don't remember ever feeling invulnerable in my life, not as a child, certainly not. So for me, this was a big growth experience, and it's connected me to my work. It's connected me to wonderful people and survivors. So that's what When You're Falling Dive is about. It's about surrendering to what life is giving you and being willing to discover what has yet to be revealed. Staying curious about your life. That's the key. Staying curious. As one woman says to me in the book, no matter what's happening in the moment, something else is also true. Something else is also true. Up against the wall or in a very, very dark place, it can feel like it's forever. It can feel completely hopeless. There's not a hint of light. But if you can remember that not all of the information is in, and stay curious about what you haven't yet seen, that will give you the energy to move through those intractable times, those times when you just don't know how you're going to put one foot in front of the other. Are as afraid of the light as they are of the dark. People are as afraid of freedom as they are of being imprisoned. And a lot of us on the spiritual path, when we start to glimpse what liberation might look like, shrink back to our, to the familiar confines of our life. We don't move toward freedom in the same way that we don't often move toward truth, because it forces us to change. I mean, it forces us to move out of the status quo into the unknown. And if you see the unknown as a creative place, as a place where you're going to discover new things, and see emptiness as full and radiant, that's completely different than seeing the gap or the unknown as a void that's going to swallow you up and you're going to lose everything. So the fear of freedom and the fear of liberation and the fear of the light, in my experience, is as strong as the fear of the darkness. It's easier to hang out in the dark and feel sorry for ourselves, or tell ourselves that it's not possible, that we can't make a change. It's admitting that we can change and that we have choice. That's the true challenge. So that has been my experience. Thanks for that question. It's great. Thanks. The question is, how does it feel to be a bodhisattva? And my answer is, I have no idea. But I do love teaching, and what I find is that it enlarges my life. I was a writer for many years and locked in my room, very selfishly focused on the next book or the next article. And this gets me out into the world. It enables me. I find out what I know through teaching. Yes, when I answer a question, I discover what I know. In the same way that a lot of writers say they don't know what they think until they write it down. I don't know what I think often until I say it in a group like this. So it's very enriching for me and for my life. I love meeting people, and we're all on this path together. I'm not a bodhisattva. I feel like a brother seeker. That's all. Yeah. But thank you for that. Thank you. What I would say is that without death, we wouldn't need spirituality. Without death, we certainly wouldn't need religion. The reason for religion comes from the awareness of our own extinction and not knowing how to deal with that information. I mean, we're the only animals on the planet that know we're going to die. And coping with that knowledge throughout our lives is grueling. So without something to hold to, without some sense of what's larger than us or what might be coming after death, it's very hard to move through life as a mortal creature. So that's why many people are attracted to spirituality and to religion. That's how I started my path. It wasn't until my life was threatened that I started asking myself, is there anything metaphysical here? I wouldn't have done that had I not had my physical body not been threatened. So for me personally, there was a direct link between the fear of dying, the awareness of the possibility of mortality, and seeking and looking for answers and looking beyond the obvious, beyond the appearance of things. That's what death encourages us to do. It's a great teacher. And it also helps you to appreciate your life. I mean, for me, spirituality is about appreciation and opening to the moment, and to savoring life. And if we were going to live forever, that experience would change completely. It would just be a never-ending, good time, or who would need any depth? Who would need any kind of spiritual awareness? We're caught in the ego. Yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah, there's a different kind of death. You were saying that there's a different kind of death, which is the ego death, the mystic death that comes with awakening. And we can't experience our lives fully or be aware of the larger being if we're trapped inside that small I. So there has to be a death, there has to be a destruction before there can be that growth of wisdom. Thank you. The thing is the soul having a contract and just choosing the family, choosing the life it's going to incarnate into. But we don't know that during our traumatic childhoods and don't find it out until 40 or 50 years on. How does that change our experience? It changes our experience because it changes the story that we tell ourselves about purpose, meaning, why things have happened, who we are. The story changes. Trauma isn't about what happens to us. It's about how we hold it within ourselves and how it's affected us internally. It's not about what happens to us. If it were about what happens to us, there would be no hope. There would be no healing from trauma. But we can change the story of trauma, and we can give it significance. For instance, with that idea of the soul contract. That's not something that speaks to me, but I know that it helps a lot of people. Terrific. I mean, we live by stories. Stories aren't the ultimate truth, but they're how we navigate the world. They're how we move through the world. Story is like the body. The body isn't the ultimate truth, but we need it to navigate through the world. The same thing with story. And story has a great purpose if we use it to positive ends. And that kind of a story can help enormously in giving reason and purpose to something that otherwise seems like meaningless suffering. It's all about how you're holding it in the present moment. So it doesn't matter if you're 50 or 60 or 70 when you find this out, you can shift the narrative and how you frame what's happened to you and how you see yourself as a victim or not a victim. Just think of that. I mean, all of a sudden you're not a victim because your soul has chosen this suffering. That completely turns the picture around, doesn't it? That can be very, very healing. It doesn't change what happened to you, but it changes how you're holding it. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's a great question. How do we maintain a positive attitude without going into denial? You know, and that's a great question. It's a very complicated question for a lot of people in the New Age movement. Things like affirmations and positive thinking. You know, there's a kind of tyranny of positive thinking. The idea that you've got to keep up with those cheerful thoughts or your life's going to fall apart. But that's based on the idea that you're creating reality at every moment, or that you're manifesting what's happening in your life at every moment, which of course we're not. You know, it's a dance with life. But if you have this idea that your thoughts are so powerful that you are solely responsible for what happens to you, then there's a great pressure to think positively and do those affirmations. But in my experience, affirmations can actually be very disassociating. If what you're feeling is pain, and you're looking in the mirror and saying, I'm very happy and I'm beautiful and everything is perfect in my life, what does that do? It denies the truth of your feelings. This is about telling the truth. If spirituality is about anything, it's about being truthful. Philosophy, the love of truth. You know, how can we sit and lie to ourselves if we're suffering and telling ourselves, you know, how beautiful and perfect everything is? So that there is a tyranny of positive thinking, especially in the New Age movement, that doesn't help people. A lot of New Age folks want to sort of leap into the light, when the fact is that it's in the darkness that we grow. That's where our depth comes from. That's where creativity germinates. You know, to try to skip over the darkness and the pain, the wounds, is to miss the depths of your own life. It's to miss your own deep waters. And there's a terrible loss in that. Without the shadow, there is no light. You know, they have to go together, yin and yang. This isn't an original concept. But a lot of folks just want yin. You know, they don't want yang. And that leads to that can lead to a very unbalanced life. I would rather be truthfully unhappy than dishonestly cheerful. I think there's more authentic energy in that than in keeping up a smiley face and feeling bitter or hurt or unseen inside. Do you know what I'm saying? About going through an illness, right? And realizing that you had always felt invisible, yes. And wanting to bring yourself into the light, bring yourself into being. What's interesting to me is that you did that by becoming visible to yourself.
First.
But did you find that once you had seen yourself, that you craved other people's attention less? Right.
Oh, well, no, I think I had to go through another process, another 20 years on.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a long-term journey.
Yeah,
but,
yeah. That's
I
great.
feel more like that now, yes.
Where you don't crave it as much.
Yeah.
You don't crave attention as much.
I'm okay with myself.
Right, because you're giving yourself the attention that you need.
Indeed.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Questions, please.
Yeah. Just
The fact that if your true strength comes out of the darkness and you're going through a dark time,
Right.
then you can honestly look in the mirror during a dark time and say everything's great. Right. I think that's skipping a step. Honestly, I think there's a bit of magical thinking for me in that, because it's taking you out of the present moment. In the present moment, you're suffering. There's pain. There's obstacle. There's challenge. There's brokenness. There's struggle. So to stand there and say, well, just because I know this is going to lead me to a better place, therefore I'm not suffering now, isn't quite accurate in my experience. Absolutely. Now I understand what you're saying. So it's not that you're denying your feelings. You're just aware that something else is also true. That there's wisdom coming from this. That it's deepening you. That's bringing you closer to the truth. And that is absolutely how one gets through the hardest times as a spiritual seeker, is knowing that it's taking you beyond what you know into territory that you haven't discovered yet, that you're being opened by the experience. That's the funny thing about being a seeker is when great things happen. Of course, everyone wants to be happy and content and great things to happen. But on the spiritual path, when bad things happen or challenging things happen, it's even better. because you know that it's going to force you into a new level of awareness. So you can become grateful for the pain and grateful for the loss. It's not a cheerful gratitude sometimes, but it's a deep satisfaction knowing that it's not wasted. That was the number one, for me, turnaround when I went through this experience. I had grown up in a very depressive household where pain and depression were just a raw deal. There was no benefit to it. There was nothing to be learned from it. It was just an affliction. And when I realized that there was a whole world of seekers out there for whom suffering, for whom depression, for whom pain were actually the starting point of a new way of life, it turned everything around for me. Suddenly it became very, very inspiring. And I realized that I had actually come from a very rich background. It wasn't one I would have chosen. My soul, I don't think, would have chosen that. But it couldn't have been a better background for someone who is a writer and who's interested in self-inquiry. So you hold both are true. Both are true. Please. It's a complicated question. What is the difference between a person who's in a suicidal depression, who commits suicide, and the person who uses that to move forward in their lives? It's a combination of things. I think it's biology in terms of brain chemistry. I think it's luck in terms of where you find yourself in that moment, the support that you have around you. The willingness to be, to discover and to change and to be surprised, to stay curious, that's a huge thing. Because depression, what depression says is, this is it. This is it. It's never going to change. That's how it defeats us. But when we realize that it's lying to us, and that's the depression talking, and then that in fact we have no idea what's coming down the pike, that can give you the strength to move into the next day. And when you're going through a hard time, as you know, that's all you really need. You're just trying to get to the next step, to the next day. Practices that we can use when we're going through the hardest times. I'm a writer and a writing teacher, so I recommend writing and self-inquiry through writing. And there are many modalities for doing that. But when you're going through the hardest of times, just asking yourself the right questions can move you forward in ways that you're not expecting. But you need to learn to ask questions. We're not taught to ask ourselves challenging questions. We're not taught self-inquiry. We're taught to believe what we're told. So when you're going through a hard time, it turns you inward, and that's the value of it. And so writing is a great way of getting to the truth of what's going on. Just knowing what the truth is in that moment can be very energizing and very empowering. So I say write and ask yourself deep questions. Check in what's really going on. What is my story about what's going on? What are my expectations about what's coming because of what's going on? And go into your narrative, and that will free you to come out the other side into the reality of what's actually coming down the pike. It increases the pain. Yeah. So to the degree that we can surrender to whatever it is that's happening, just say okay to whatever it is, we release that resistance. We open ourselves to energy. And to new ideas and to new ways of moving forward. But when we're clutched, you're right, nothing can get in, and we sap ourselves of our own power. Thank you. That's a good point. So if you're going through a hard time in your life, if you find yourself in a moment of serious transition, if you feel hope draining away from you and you can't find your way forward, ask yourself, what is the truth of the moment today, in this very second? What is the truth of what's going on? And that will help you get underneath the narrative and underneath the scary stories that your mind is telling you and the negative predictions that you're creating about what's coming. It will bringing yourself into the moment balances you in the midst of the storm. That's actually what balances us and gives us leverage in difficult times. Is being truthful and staying in the present moment. In the present moment, almost everything is bearable. It's the anticipation of what's coming that can be so unbearable. So that's what I learned talking to the people in When You're Falling Dive. It's what I have lived in my own life for 30 years. And just remember that you have a strength in you that you may not be aware of that will only come out once you start to lose and once you start to be challenged in ways that you wouldn't have welcomed. That could be the beginning of a whole new life for you. So, thanks.
Thank you, Mark.